Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to finally give you my final review on the Laowa 15mm f2.0D lens. Now, first of all, I do want to extend an apology to the Laowa people that have been kind enough to be patient on me. I ran into a bit of an issue to where I ran out of time with my first copy of the A7R Mark III, which I had to send back after my review period was up, but I wasn't quite finished with the Laowa. And so as a result, I thought there was only going to be a gap of a few days. It ended up being, closer to a month. And so thanks to the great people at Laowa for being patient with me with this loaner while I finished up the review. So first of all, if you haven't already watched the episode, I would recommend that you look at the build quality episode that breaks what I'm about to cover in more detail. I'm just going to hit a very few of the high points on this. Laowa has demonstrated the ability to build beautifully constructed lenses that really, they're very, very similar in operation to classic Zeiss lenses. Everything metal and glass, very beautifully damped. Of course, manual focus, everything. And so, there's a sensibility about there that is like classic Zeiss. And I say classic as opposed to Milvus because, Milvus lenses are now fully weather sealed, and that's one area where the Laowa is lacking. It doesn't have any kind of weather sealing. At the same time, it also doesn't have any kind of electronics. And so, to be fair, there are fewer things to be damaged. You would have to have a pretty severe moisture situation to cause a whole lot of physical damage to the lens itself. Not that I recommend getting it wet, but I'm just saying a lot of things that break down on camera components these days are electronic related. Now, one other highlight of the build design on this particular lens is the ability to either have traditional aperture clicks or, at full stops between f2 and f22. You also have the ability to declick the aperture, which if you're a videographer would be very interesting in that it allows you just to kind of smoothly rack through the apertures without any kind of hard stops. And so it allows you to do, kind of smooth aperture changes in video work. And so that's certainly a plus for that. And even, on that note, for manual focus, it has a really nicely damped, precise manual focus ring. And so if you're using something geared, for example, you will get nice results out of this. And the focus throw, I think, is going to be within, good tolerances for your, any kind of geared focus follow drive you might have. Another huge plus here is that unlike a lot of lenses that this would compete with, you do have the ability to use traditional filters in a very common 72mm size. And so in a lot of cases, you're dealing with a bulbous front element with a lens like this, which means you have to go to much bigger, bulkier, more expensive square filter systems. But beyond that, and something that I think sometimes gets overlooked with lenses like this, is also how nice it is to have just a traditional pinch, lens cap that can very easily go into a pocket or a bag and not some big bulky thing that has to go over a fixed, lens hood and as a result doesn't fit very well into pockets. And so another nice plus there. Now, I've already mentioned the lack of electronics in the lens, and I detail more of how that plays out in the episode that I've mentioned. But I do want to say that one kind of major downside to a lack of electronics here is that it means that you're not going to get any kind of standard profile, or as we're going to see in a moment, even if you do apply a profile, there are a few minor issues that come as a result of all the lens information not being transmitted to the camera and thus to your software. For example, the aperture value that you're using. Now, moving on from that, let's talk about the image quality here for a moment. In my initial test, I have an episode that I would recommend you take a look at where I've already broken down image quality in detail and kind of hit all the major issues and strengths as a part of that. But what that did lack was it lacked any kind of infinity focus test. And just in conversations with people in the industry, they pointed out that, a lens like this is kind of optimized for infinity purposes. And so maybe my observations wouldn't be as true at infinity. So, that's a very fair point. And so I decided that I would reshoot that and also throw in an Aps-C comparison, because the physical size of this lens being, only, kind of moderately sized, and even on the small end compared to a lot of competitors, means that it actually it translates onto APS-C quite well as well. It balances well, and the focal length there is still a very useful, somewhere around 23 millimeters, which is still kind of in the sweet spot for landscape purposes. And so let's jump into our image quality segment and take a look at what I found shooting at infinity, and I'm going to throw a couple of other things in there as a bonus. Okay, first thing I want to do is just give you a quick peek at how it looks on APS-C. This is a Sony a6500 24 megapixel sensor. So you can see that the vignette issues because of the crop are completely eliminated. And of course, this is still a very usable focal length that, puts you pretty close to the classic 24 millimeters of framing, just a little bit wider than that. And so definitely useful. So here at f2, we can see that as we saw on full frame, there is a little bit of a lower contrast, just a very slight amount of veiling that you can see there. But really our center sharpness looks pretty decent, and as we move out towards the edge of the frame, as we saw on full frame, and of course magnified even more so here, there's really very little image deterioration off towards the edge of the frame. It's a pretty even sharpness profile, and so we can see here even right out to the edge of the frame at f2, we've got a pretty decent result. Now, if we compare the f2 result on the left to an f2.8 result on the right, we can see that while they look fairly similar, you can see that there is a little bit more contrast, a little bit less of this, there's kind of a hazy edge on the bare trees here. You can see that it's just more defined there at the f2.8, so certainly an improvement there. Off towards the edge of the frame, I really don't see a notable amount of difference here at f2.8. The two look roughly similar, and the nature of the chromatic aberration, these lateral chromatic aberrations, you can see just a little bit of purple and green fringing there. Lateral chromatic aberrations aren't really affected by the lens being stopped down. Fortunately, they're a one-click correction. Finally, a look at f8 here, and this is probably within the optimal zone for shooting landscapes. It definitely looks like there's more punch in the center of the frame to me, and we've got a pretty even result moving off towards the edges here. As you can see, both sides of the frame look pretty good, and so this is definitely a very usable lens on APS-C as well, and size-wise, it's a nice fit there also. Now, if we put the APS-C result on the left and we put the wide open full frame result on the right, you can see how much of that vignette is being eliminated by the crop factor. A pretty significant difference there. Now, in dealing with this vignette, and of course there's really isn't much of any barrel distortion to deal with, Laowa does have a profile that you can download off their website. However, I'm not a big fan of it. Number one is that it's going to be kind of an across-the-board correction in that because the software has no way of knowing what aperture it is due to no electronics, it's going to apply the same amount of correction to vignette regardless of aperture, and even wide open aperture. If you'll look here in the corners, and I'm going to pull up one of these corners for you to take a look at, you can see how that in the extreme corners there's actually an overcorrection where there's just this kind of weird bright point that is actually, it's harder to resolve that than it would be to just add a manual correction to the vignette there. And so I would suggest instead that if you want to use this lens and you want to correct the vignette from it, I would suggest just quickly making up manual profiles in Lightroom for each aperture, and then you can select the appropriate one, that you've kind of fine-tuned and get a better result. Now, the heavy vignette is exaggerated here by the fact that the lens, and I think because of the vignette, that the lens does tend to underexpose just a little bit. Center exposure is not bad, but there's heavy vignette. And so what I've done, as you'll see in all of these, particularly as we compare them to the Tamron, I've just brighten them up about 3/4 of a stop to equalize the histograms and so that we have more equal results. And so just to give you a look at the side-by-side result, I'm going to put the original result here on the left and then the result here on the right. It's just even in the center of the frame, it's a more, I think, more balanced exposure. And, and so that just gives you an idea of the difference there. It's just it's a better across-the-board result. Okay, so we're going to look at the f2 result here in on full frame. And so as you can see, center of the frame, other again than that kind of light veiling that's there, there's just not a huge amount of contrast here on some of those textures. Detail, however, is really pretty good. I mean, the lens is resolving quite well, and as you can see, even out to here, we're still getting good results. At the very edge of the frame, results are not bad. It's just the combination of vignette and then that loud chromatic aberration is providing a little bit of just what I might call some murkiness. But really in terms of the raw resolution of the lens, it's doing a pretty good job at f2, and this is a 42 megapixel, very demanding sensor here. And of course, on top of that, we're looking at infinity and bright conditions here. And so it's really done a pretty decent job, truth be told, in dealing with this. Now comparing the f2 result on the left to the f2.8 result here on the right, we can see if we look in the center of the frame, it's not a major difference. What we do see is just a little bit more contrast, a little bit better resolving of those textures there, and you can just see there's a little less of that kind of hazy look. Say, look at this compared to here. It's not a marked difference, but there is a mild difference there. Moving out to the edge of the frame here, not a great amount of difference between these two apertures. You're going to need to stop on down further than that if you really want to see a significant difference between the values. Now, of course, the move to f2.8 here allows us to bring the Tamron back into the comparison. And so we can take a look here at 15 millimeters on the Tamron via the Sigma MC11 adapter. Now, you will note that I had this set up on aperture priority, a very bright scene. Also, by the way, a very cold scene. I was exposed in a very cold wind blowing throughout this series. But anyway, so what I've done is I've just balanced out the histograms a little bit to make them as even as possible here. And so if we look at the center of the frame, what you can see is that the Tamron has got pretty fabulous center of the frame contrast and resolution. And so it still looks better at infinity, in my opinion, by a fairly good margin here at f2.8. And just you can see all the way out towards infinity, there's better micro contrast there, center of the frame. Now, if we move out to the edge of the frame, I do think that the Tamron is still a hair better, but obviously the difference is not nearly as pronounced. The Laowa has a little bit more even sharpness profile than what the Tamron does. You can also see the Laowa is a little bit, even at infinity, it's a little bit wider than what the Tamron lens is. And that's true on both sides of the frame. And so it's, there's probably a millimeter or so difference between the two lenses in the angle of view. Now stopping on down to f5.6, you can see that Vignette has lifted a little bit further, but it's not necessarily a huge improvement over f4. And so this is what I'm alluding to when I say that the Vignette is a little bit slow to completely clear up. Now, if we look at the center of the frame, f5.6 is a little bit sharper than f4. And again, just a little bit of an improvement in contrast and the textures, and off towards edge of the frame, we can see just a little bit step further in absolute crispness there on some of those fine details, and so things are looking, and you can really see it here on the right side. There's just we're losing that kind of softness that blurs the delineation between, sharp edges and the background. Here, those just stand out more against the sky. Now, if we do one final comparison with the Tamron here, we can see Tamron wins when it comes to Vignette. We've got definitely it's pretty much clear of Vignette at f5.6. Center of the frame here, we can once again see, Tamron's it does a pretty amazing job of resolving very crisp, very tightly defined edges there. And so, of course, that looks pretty great there on the center of the frame. Now, if we move off towards the edge of the frame, there's really not a whole lot to separate the two lenses. They look, pretty close to the same. We'll look at those branches up near the sky. And in this case, I would say that the Laowa obviously is doing a little bit better than the Tamron on this right side. It looks crisper along the edge of the frame. Now, if we kind of just go into more, kind of a real world scenario, this is a handheld shot on a Sony a7R III, so 42 megapixels that I took just a couple of days ago. Actually, I took yesterday. And as you can see, I mean, I think that's just a beautiful result that's come out of this. And if we look at our plane of focus, I mean, that's a huge amount of detail that's rendered. I mean, look at how fine you can see. You can actually see individual pine needles there at that distance. And so, I mean, real world sharpness, I think this lens is doing a pretty great job. I mean, I just think that's a pretty fabulous amount of detail, and this is right out to the edge of the frame here. And so, I mean, bottom line is that the Laowa, you know, even if you're comparing it to the Tamron, yes, the Tamron has certain advantages, but at the same time, the Laowa is rendering plenty of detail for real world use, and, you know, is a nice match for the high resolution sensor of the a7R III. Now, in our image quality segment, we noted the lack of distortion on the Laowa, and you know what a difference that makes for those that do shoot interiors. And so here I've got a shot of my son's bedroom. He's got a beautiful room. It's not always the cleanest, but it's right next to my office, and so it's easy access. So one thing I want you to note here is on the Tamron, you can see that there is a bit of a curve along the outside of this bookshelf here, whereas on the Laowa you have a nice straight line. And in fact, you know, that extra width at closer distances, it seems like the width is more noticeable on the Laowa. And so I would say the Tamron actually exhibits, you know, a little bit of a kind of a reverse focus breathing. And so it's not quite as wide as what it is. We saw that in Infinity, the Laowa was wider, but not hugely so. Here at closer distances, like for interiors, there's a more marked difference. You know, you can see there's a wall that's included in the Laowa shot. There's part of a door that's there, and both of those things are missing on the Tamron result. And so also that bit of a bulge along that, and in this case, you know, we're kind of fortunate that some of the lines, like in the center of the frame, are obscured by the bed. But if you're doing interior shots and you had to correct for this distortion, number one, you're going to lose even more width out of the edge of your frame. And so if you're someone that does real estate, you know, or architectural photography, the Laowa should really be, you know, near the top of your list. And you look even here towards the top, more of this light fixture is visible than it is on the Tamron. And so, and at the same time on the Laowa, you're really not going to have to worry about correcting any kind of distortion. As far as barrel distortion, there really isn't any there. And so as a result, I mean, that's a pretty huge advantage here for the Laowa. So what I did observe is that for the most part, my previous observations were accurate even at infinity. And I didn't really see anything that kind of changed my opinion, so to speak. But as you can see in, you know, one of those final shots, the lens has plenty of resolution at landscape apertures for doing what you need to do with it, and certainly is a very viable option for landscape purposes at that. And so, you know, good image quality there overall. Now, I do want to point out a little bit further for video use. I've already detailed a few things in terms of the handling, but this really is a great focal length for video use. It would be great for those that, you know, for example, you know, might vlog or something like that. It's a you know, a nice wide focal length, but the low distortion means you get a little less kind of weirdness out of it with a wider focal length, and shooting it like in Super 35 or crop mode makes that even more of a natural point of view. But the other big plus here is that if you're someone that maybe films real estate walkthroughs or something where there are going to be straight lines within your shots, a lens like this is a huge asset in that, I mean, obviously it's very difficult to correct distortion for video in post. And so being able to have, you know, basically no barrel distortion with a very wide angle of view is it's a huge plus for video. And so again, if you're a real estate shooter or shoot architecture or city work in some way, this could be a pretty huge asset for you in filming on the lens, using it for that. And I found that in using it on an A7R Mark III, and I threw it onto a gimbal system, that I got footage that was really very useful, very attractive, and good. So in summation, let me just kind of point out where I think that this lens sits in terms of the market. One thing that Sony's lineup lacks, at least to this point, is any kind of real tilt shift option. And so obviously this is not a tilt shift lens. And so, I mean, if you have it, kind of tilted up or down in relation to your subject, you are still going to get some of that keystoning effect. For example, buildings or trees leaning or, in or out, depending on which angle you're shooting at. And so it's not a substitute for a tilt shift in that sense. However, for those that are more concerned in just getting nice straight lines and you're shooting, relatively level to the sensor, shooting interiors, for example, this may be the next best thing for you to a tilt shift, and of course at a, a much lower price point compared to a dedicated tilt shift lens. And so that low distortion plus having a nice wide focal length is, it's the real deal in certain situations. And so, for example, if I were looking at shooting an interior space, and every now and then I'll do some branding for a hotel or something like that. And so if I'm shooting in a situation like that, well, I like the Tamron that I own, that I've referenced in this review. I like it for a lot of things. It's a great landscape lens. I enjoy it for a lot of purposes. But I would almost certainly choose a lens like this for that kind of work over the Tamron, for the reason that you're just going to get the full 15 millimeters angle of view. You're going to get straighter lines, and thus you're just going to get more pleasing results. And if you're a busy person like myself, perhaps more importantly, there's going to be less work to do in post-processing because you're going to start off with straight lines to begin with. That's pretty huge. And so, you might want to consider that for yourself. So as I've detailed, I've been very honest about shortcomings in this lens. It's not a perfect lens, but at the same time, it is a very useful one that is, I think, unique in Sony's lineup at this point. It has a wider maximum aperture than equivalent lenses at f2. Obviously, for low light situations, you're letting in twice as much light as an f2.8 lens. And, then of course, if you're looking at, one of these zoom lenses that at this focal length may be closer to f4, I mean, you're letting in a hugely greater amount of light compared to an f4 lens. And the fact that it has useful sharpness at f2 makes it very useful for that kind of application. The low distortion level is unique amongst competitors, and that certainly is a strength. And then finally, the ability to use traditional filters means that you can go out and you can shoot landscapes, you can throw on a neutral density filter and shoot long exposures, for example. And you're not going to have to resort to a very big, expensive, bulky aftermarket filter system. So all of those things make this a selling point. And I think the compact size is also nice in that this is a lens that you can throw this into your bag and bring it along without being punished too much. My Tamron lens is so big that I have to be pretty intentional, know that I'm going to be using that lens before I'm going to be willing to pack along the bulk and the weight, even though I love the images that it produces. So in this case, if you own this lens, it might be more likely to come along with you. So all in all, again, while it's not a perfect lens, I think that for certain shooters, this is going to be a very, very useful lens that they will get a lot of mileage out of. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you'll find a few things. Number one, I've got a full written review supported by a lot of documentation that you can find on my website, dustinabbott.net, and there's a linkage to that review there. You can also find some buying links at various retailers if you're interested in purchasing one of these for yourself. You can follow me there on social media or become a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.